Back again on the Ghostly.A channel. Before that, don't forget to subscribe. The Meatball Vendor of Java. In a small village nestled deep within the lush, green forests of Java, there lived a man named Pakwirio. Pakwirio was an ordinary man by all appearances, with a thin frame, graying hair, and a kind smile that hid a lifetime of struggles. He had inherited his father's humble meatball cart, known locally as a Gerobak Bakso, and had spent his life trying to make ends meet. Every day, he would push his cart through the narrow, winding streets of the village, calling out in a sing-song voice, "Bakso, Bakso Panis," inviting villagers to taste his savory meatball soup. Despite his hard work and the delicious aroma of his steaming bakso, Pakwirio's earnings were meager. The competition in the village was fierce, with several other bakso vendors selling their own versions of the popular dish. As the years went by, Pakwirio watched in dismay as younger vendors, with their modern carts and flashy marketing, began to steal away his loyal customers. Desperate to save his livelihood and ensure a better future for his family, Pakwirio sought the advice of an old friend, Pak Komar, who was known for his deep knowledge of ancient Javanese rituals and magic. Pak Komar was a man of mystery, living alone in a secluded hut on the edge of the forest. He was rumored to have connections with the spirit world and to possess knowledge of Pasujihin, a type of dark magic that could grant wealth and success at a cost. Pakwirio had heard the whispers of what Pasujihin could do, but he had always dismissed it as mere superstition. However, as his financial situation grew more desperate, Pakwirio found himself considering the unthinkable. One evening, under the cover of darkness, Pakwirio made his way to Pak Komar's hut. The forest was eerily quiet, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the wind. The hut, illuminated by the soft glow of a single oil lamp, looked even more foreboding than Pakwirio had imagined. With a deep breath, he knocked on the door. Pak Komar opened the door slowly, his weathered face revealing no surprise at the sight of his old friend. "I've been expecting you," he said in a low, gravelly voice. Without waiting for an answer, he gestured for Pakwirio to enter. Inside the hut, the air was thick with the scent of burning incense. Strange symbols were drawn on the walls, and a small altar with offerings of fruit and flowers stood in the corner. Pakwirio felt a shiver run down his spine as Pak Komar sat across from him, fixing him with a penetrating gaze. "You seek wealth, don't you?" Pak Komar asked, though he already knew the answer. Pakwirio hesitated, but then nodded. "I need to save my business. My family depends on it." Pak Komar remained silent for a moment before speaking again. "There is a way," he said slowly, "but it is not without risk. You must be willing to make a great sacrifice." Pakwirio's heart pounded in his chest. "What do I have to do?" Pak Komar leaned forward, lowering his voice to a whisper. "You must perform a ritual to summon a spirit known as a Tuyul. This spirit will grant you wealth and success in your business, but in return, you must make an offering. It must be something precious, something that holds great meaning to you." Pakwirio's mind raced. He had heard stories of people who had made deals with spirits, only to meet tragic ends. But the thought of losing his business, of seeing his family suffer, was too much to bear. With a heavy heart, he agreed. The ritual was to be performed on the night of the full moon. Pakwirio was instructed to bring a lock of hair from his youngest child, a boy named Artie, as the offering. Pak Komar assured him that no harm would come to Artie, but Pakwirio couldn't shake the feeling of dread that settled over him. On the appointed night, Pakwirio gathered the necessary items, candles, incense, and the lock of Artie's hair, and made his way to a secluded spot in the forest, as Pak Komar had instructed. The moon was full, casting an eerie light over the trees. Pakwirio felt as if the very air around him was alive with unseen forces. He followed Pak Komar's instructions to the letter, arranging the items in a circle and reciting the ancient incantation. As he spoke the final words, a cold wind swept through the clearing, extinguishing the candles. Pakwirio felt a presence behind him, and when he turned, he saw a small, shadowy figure standing just at the edge of the light. The figure was no taller than a child, with eyes that glowed an unnatural shade of red. It was the Tuyul. The spirit's gaze fixed on the lock of hair in Pak Wirio's trembling hand, and without a word, it reached out and took it. Pak Wirio's heart pounded in his chest as the Tuyul whispered a single word, "Done," before disappearing into the shadows. The following day, Pak Wirio went about his usual routine, pushing his Bakso cart through the village. To his astonishment, customers began flocking to him in droves. His Bakso had never tasted better, and word spread quickly through the village. Within weeks, Pak Wirio's cart became the most popular in the area, and his earnings soared. But with his newfound success came a creeping sense of unease. Pak Wirio began to notice strange occurrences around his home. Shadows flitted at the edge of his vision, and at night, he heard faint whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. Artie, his once lively and cheerful son, grew pale and withdrawn. He often spoke of nightmares in which a small figure with glowing red eyes visited him in the dark. Pak Wirio's fear grew with each passing day, but he felt trapped. The wealth and success he had gained were undeniable, but the price he had paid weighed heavily on his soul. He avoided Pak Komar, fearing what the old man might say or do then. One night, Pak Wirio awoke to find Artie standing at the foot of his bed, his eyes wide with terror. "Father, it's here," the boy whispered, his voice trembling. Pak Wirio jumped out of bed and followed his son to the living room, where the Tuyul stood, its red eyes glowing in the darkness. The spirit smiled, revealing sharp, needle-like teeth. "You have kept your end of the bargain," the Tuyul hissed, "but the debt is not yet paid." Pak Wirio felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. "What do you want?" he demanded, though he already knew the answer. The Tuyul's smile widened. "Your son," it whispered. Pak Wirio's heart shattered. He had been a fool to believe he could cheat the darkness. Without thinking, he grabbed a knife from the kitchen and lunged at the Tuyul. But the spirit was too quick. With a final, mocking laugh, it vanished, leaving behind only the echo of its sinister promise. From that night on, Pak Wirio was a broken man. His wealth and success meant nothing as he watched his son slowly wither away, his spirit drained by the dark forces Pak Wirio had unleashed. The once beloved Bakso vendor became a ghost of his former self, haunted by the choices he had made. The villagers spoke in hushed tones of Pak Wirio's downfall, and his once thriving business soon fell into ruin. The old man who had once smiled so kindly now wandered the streets, his eyes empty, his heart heavy with regret. And so, the tale of Pak Wirio became a cautionary legend, a story passed down through generations. It served as a warning to all who might be tempted by the promise of easy riches, a reminder that some deals come at too high a price. As the months dragged on, the once vibrant village of Ngadarejo began to change. A heavy atmosphere seemed to settle over the town, like a blanket of fog that never lifted. Whispers spread among the villagers, whispers of strange sounds in the night and fleeting shadows that darted between the trees. The superstitious claimed that the forest had become cursed, a place where the spirits of the damned wandered freely. At the heart of this growing unease was Pak Wirio. His hair, once graying, had turned almost completely white, and his once lively eyes now held a haunted, hollow look. His skin clung to his bones, and his clothes hung loose on his frame as if he had wasted away. He no longer pushed his Bakso cart through the village. Instead, he spent his days and nights sitting in the darkened corners of his small house, muttering to himself, his mind unraveling. Artie's condition worsened with each passing day. The boy's pale face was sunken, his eyes dull, and he hardly spoke anymore. He spent most of his time in bed, too weak to move, his small body ravaged by an unseen force that drained the life from him. Pak Wirio's wife, Sari, wept constantly, her once hopeful spirit shattered by the sight of their dying son. No doctor could explain what was happening to Artie, and no medicine could ease his suffering. One night, as Pakwirio sat in the flickering light of a single candle, he heard it again, the faint, almost imperceptible sound of whispers. At first, he tried to ignore them, as he had done so many nights before. But this time, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling the room with a dissonant chorus that made his skin crawl. The air grew cold, and the shadows seemed to stretch and twist, taking on unnatural shapes. Pakwirio gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles turning white. The whispers coalesced into a single, unmistakable voice, the voice of the Tuyul. It called to him, taunting him, reminding him of the terrible bargain he had struck. "Your son is mine," the voice hissed, its words slithering through the air like venom. "You cannot escape me, Pakwirio." Pakwirio's breath came in ragged gasps as he stood, his legs trembling beneath him. He could feel the presence of the Tuyul in the room, though he couldn't see it. The shadows seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, and the candle's flame flickered violently, as if trying to stave off the darkness that encroached upon it. Desperate, Pakwirio grabbed the knife he had used to prepare bakso for years, the same knife he had tried to use against the Tuyul on that fateful night. He held it in front of him, his hands shaking, as if the cold steel could somehow protect him from the malevolent spirit. "Leave my family alone," Pakwirio shouted, his voice breaking with fear and anger. "I'll do anything you ask, just spare my son." The Tuyul's laughter echoed through the room, a chilling sound that seemed to come from all directions at once. "You made your choice, Pakwirio. There is no turning back." Suddenly, the candle's flame was snuffed out, plunging the room into complete darkness. Pakwirio's heart raced as he strained to see, but the blackness was absolute. The whispers returned, circling him, filling his mind with terror. In the darkness, Pakwirio felt a cold, clammy hand close around his wrist, the touch of the Tuyul. He screamed, jerking his arm away, but the grip tightened, pulling him down to the floor. He thrashed wildly, trying to free himself, but it was as if the very shadows had come alive, wrapping around him like a living shroud. "Let me go!" he screamed, but his voice was swallowed by the darkness. The Tuyul's voice was in his ear now, a sibilant whisper that chilled him to the bone. "You belong to me, Pakwirio. You and your son. There is no escape." Pakwirio's mind snapped. His screams turned to incoherent babbling as the shadows dragged him further into the darkness. The knife fell from his hand, clattering uselessly to the floor. The last thing he saw before the darkness consumed him entirely was the glowing red eyes of the Tuyul, burning with a hunger that would never be satisfied. Hours later, Sari awoke to the sound of her husband's cries. She rushed to the living room, only to find Pakwirio lying on the floor, his body convulsing as if he were caught in the throes of a terrible nightmare. His eyes were wide open, but they saw nothing, only the horrors that existed in his own mind. Sari fell to her knees beside him, trying to wake him, but he was unresponsive, lost in a nightmare from which he could never escape. His lips moved, but the words that came out were gibberish, a string of nonsense that made no sense to her ears. In that moment, she knew that whatever part of Pakwirio had once been her husband was gone, claimed by the darkness that had taken hold of their lives. The villagers found Pakwirio the next morning, his body cold and stiff, his eyes frozen open in a rictus of terror. Sari wept as they carried him away, her heart breaking for the man she had loved, the man who had been driven to madness and death by forces beyond their control. As they laid him to rest in the village cemetery, a strange stillness settled over the graveyard. The villagers whispered to each other, casting nervous glances at the forest beyond, where the trees seemed to sway unnaturally in the wind. Some claimed to have seen a small, shadowy figure lurking among the gravestones, watching with those same glowing red eyes. The village of Ngadarejo would never be the same. The story of Pakwirio and the terrible price he paid for his greed became a legend, a cautionary tale told to children to warn them of the dangers of tampering with forces they did not understand. But for those who had witnessed the events firsthand, the horror was all too real, a scar that would never fully heal. In the years that followed, the villagers noticed that no grass would grow on Pakwirio's grave. It remained a barren patch of earth, as if the ground itself refused to forget the darkness that had claimed him. And on nights when the moon was full and the wind whispered through the trees, some swore they could still hear the faint, mocking laughter of the tuyul, echoing through the village, a reminder that some bargains can never be undone. The Curse of Ngadarejo. The death of Pakwirio was only the beginning. In the days that followed his burial, the village of Ngadarejo descended into a waking nightmare. At first, it was subtle, small things that could be explained away as mere coincidence. But soon, there was no denying that something malevolent had taken root in the village. Children began to wake up screaming in the middle of the night, their faces pale and drenched in sweat. They spoke of nightmares filled with shadowy figures and glowing red eyes, of cold hands that reached out from under their beds and pulled them into darkness. The adults tried to dismiss these tales as just dreams, but the fear in their children's eyes told them otherwise. One by one, livestock started to die in their pens, their bodies drained of blood, with no visible wounds to explain their deaths. The villagers found only the carcasses, cold and lifeless, their eyes wide with terror. The fear that had begun as a whisper now grew into a roar as the villagers realized that Pakwirio's curse had not died with him. It had spread, infecting the entire village. At night, strange noises filled the air. The once peaceful village was now alive with the sound of whispers, the rustling of unseen creatures, and a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Doors that had been firmly shut would creak open on their own, and the wind carried with it an unbearable chill that bit deep into the villagers' bones. But the most terrifying of all were the sightings. It started with a child named Lena. She was only 6 years old, with wide eyes and a bright smile that had charmed the entire village. But that smile vanished one cold, foggy evening when Lena went missing. Her parents searched frantically, calling out her name, but the village was eerily silent, as if it were holding its breath. When they finally found her, she was standing at the edge of the forest, staring into the darkness between the trees. Her eyes were blank, her face expressionless. It was as if she were in a trance. Her mother, crying out in relief, rushed to her, but Lena didn't respond. She just kept staring into the forest, her lips moving ever so slightly, as if she were speaking to someone. "What are you saying, Lena?" her mother asked, shaking her gently. Lena's voice was barely a whisper. "He's coming." "Who's coming?" her father asked, panic rising in his chest. Lena's eyes slowly turned to meet his, and in that moment, he saw something that chilled him to the core. Her eyes had changed. They were no longer the soft brown eyes of his little girl. They had turned a deep, unnatural shade of red, glowing faintly in the dim light. "He's coming for all of us," Lena said in a voice that was not her own. It was deeper, older, filled with an ancient malice. Before they could react, Lena collapsed to the ground, unconscious. They carried her back to their home, but she never woke up. Her body remained cold and lifeless, as if the soul had been sucked out of her. The village elders, desperate for answers, declared that the forest was off limits, that no one should venture into its depths, no matter the reason. But the warnings did nothing to stop the terror. The sightings increased. Villagers began to report seeing a small figure lurking in the shadows, just at the edge of their vision. It was always just out of reach, just beyond the light, but they knew it was there, watching, waiting. The figure resembled a child, but its proportions were all wrong. It was too thin, its limbs too long, and its head too large for its body. Its skin was a sickly gray, and its eyes, those eyes were a deep, glowing red, filled with hunger and malice. It was the Tuyul, and it had come to collect its due. The village descended into chaos. People began to barricade themselves in their homes, refusing to go out after dark. But even in their homes, they weren't safe. The Tuyul would find a way in, through the cracks in the walls, under the door, or even through the keyholes. No one was safe from its reach. One night, a young woman named Ayu heard the sound of something scratching at her door. It was a slow, deliberate sound, like nails dragging across the wood. Her heart pounded in her chest as she pressed her ear to the door, listening. The scratching stopped, but then she heard a low whisper, a voice that sent shivers down her spine. Ayu. The voice was soft, almost gentle, but there was something in it that made her blood run cold. It called her name again, this time more insistent. Ayu, let me in. She backed away from the door, her hands trembling. The room grew colder, the shadows darker, and she could feel the Tuyul's presence on the other side of the door, waiting for her to open it. She wanted to scream, but fear had stolen her voice. The whispering continued, growing louder, more urgent. The scratching turned into pounding, and the door began to shake on its hinges. Ayu clapped her hands over her ears, trying to block out the noise, but it was no use. The voice was inside her head now, whispering terrible things, promising her wealth and power if she would just let it in. Just open the door, Ayu, it coaxed, its voice like honey. I'll give you everything you've ever wanted. But Ayu knew better. She had heard the stories, seen the fear in the eyes of those who had encountered the Tuyul. She knew that if she opened that door, she would be lost forever. Summoning every ounce of strength she had left, Ayu ran to the window and flung it open, screaming for help. Her screams echoed through the night, piercing the silence of the cursed village. But no one came. No one dared. The door finally burst open with a loud crash, and Ayu turned just in time to see the Tuyul slip into the room, its glowing red eyes fixed on her. It smiled, revealing sharp, needle-like teeth. The sight of it froze her in place, her body refusing to move as the Tuyul slowly advanced on her. The last thing Ayu saw before darkness claimed her was those terrible red eyes, burning with an insatiable hunger. And then, there was nothing. By morning, the villagers found her lifeless body sprawled on the floor, her face twisted in a silent scream. The elders knew then that the village was doomed, that the darkness they had allowed into their midst could never be banished. Desperation turned to despair as more villagers fell prey to the Tuyul. They stopped leaving their homes altogether, cowering in fear, waiting for the inevitable. They knew the Tuyul would come for them, one by one, until there was no one left. The once thriving village of Ngadarejo became a ghost town, its streets empty, its homes abandoned. The forest, once a place of beauty and life, became a dark and twisted place, where the trees whispered of forgotten horrors and the wind carried the cries of the damned. And still, the Tuyul wandered the village, its red eyes glowing in the darkness, searching for its next victim. It was a creature born of greed and desperation, a spirit that would never rest until it had claimed every soul in Ngadarejo. In the years that followed, travelers who passed by the village spoke of hearing strange noises at night, of seeing glowing red eyes watching them from the darkness. They spoke of a village where no one lived, but where something waited in the shadows, always hungry, always watching. And those who ventured too close to the forest's edge often disappeared, their screams lost to the wind. The village of Ngadarejo was no more, but its curse lived on, a dark stain on the land, a warning to all who might be tempted by the promise of easy riches. For in the end, the price of greed is always paid in blood. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe.